Good evening. Welcome to the School of Visual Arts. My name's Tom Hoon. I chair the BFA program in Visual and Critical Studies, and we are sponsoring this evening's event. We're really happy to have José Parlá with us this evening, a really special artist with a lot of things actually up in New York right now to see. Let me just briefly tell you a little bit about José as way of introduction. José Parlá started painting in the early 1980s, exhibiting his works in the streets of Miami. He also studied at the Miami-Dade Community College, the New World School of the Arts, and Savannah College of Art and Design. José's work has been exhibited worldwide, and earlier this year, José's first museum solo show, titled Segmented Realities, took place at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, Georgia. We are all, no doubt, also aware of the current exhibitions of his work at the Bryce Wolkowitz and Mary Boone Galleries, as well as his recent commissions at One World Trade Center and the Barclays Center, Brooklyn. Now, when I was looking over some of the many things that have been written about José's work, one in particular really stuck out for me, and it's, I think, the most succinct and the most sweeping description that I've read of his work. It comes from a recent essay by a really fantastic writer you all should become aware of named Greg Tate. And Greg Tate writes the following: "What José Parlá's paintings force us to realize, as good historical paintings always do, is that given enough time and entropy, even the hurtling locomotive motion of the streets can be arrested, contemplated, symbolically apprehended, studied, replicated. The temptation to call Parla a post-graffiti painter is great, but I'd prefer we recognize him as a historical landscape painter, even though his historical landscape is made of concrete, wood, and wallboard, and his histories derive from personal memories and from events buried and embedded in the gorgeous erosions and ruination time and weather will deposit on your average urban walls." End quote. Thank you, Greg Tate. Please, will you all join me in giving a really warm welcome to a really wonderful historical landscape painter.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I was a big fan of SVA as a student. Although I didn't come here, I would come and visit friends in New York when we would drive all the way from Florida, and we would drive from Savannah, Georgia, come and hang out. And a lot of the artists that I knew of my own age were attending SVA, so it's nice to be here. It's an honor. Thank you, Peter and Tom, for having me, and everyone for organizing this. I'm going to first talk about some things that it's not about my work, but just about my personal life and the kind of bridges and things that I've understood to be part of the stories that are embedded into my work that have also inspired me as a person and as a painter. There's not much of a separation there. So the photo up here is my mom and dad. They are of Cuban descent. They were born in Cuba and moved to the United States in the 1970s. At that time in Cuba, it was the classic heyday of all the music and, you know, what we've become accustomed to knowing as like the pre-revolutionary Cuba. You have singers like Benny Moré and Celia Cruz, you know, who have been tremendously inspiring in my life and in my creativity because of the energy and the joy. And the reason I bring up music is because it's a huge part of who I am, and there's a dance to my painting, and there's a kind of energy that comes from this legacy of music in Cuba. Fulgencio Batista was a dictator that took over Cuba in the 1950s and was pretty corrupt. He had a lot of connects with the American and Italian mafia. Cuba was kind of like the playground for the Sicilian mafia and the New York and American mafia, so sort of fight for turf. And that all changed when Fidel and Che Guevara came through. And, you know, at first everybody really liked these guys. and they did a lot of interesting things in the revolution, and a lot of people gave them a chance, and you know, that was a big part of why, you know, 3 million Cubans ended up eventually coming to the United States. You know, and a lot of this energy that comes from Cuba and the revolutionary spirit, whether I agree with one side or the other, and at different times, gone back and forth, and finally just disagree with everything, that energy is still embedded in who I am as a person, and what I do with my work, because it's really important to show that. In the 1970s, I was born in Miami, and before I knew it, I moved to Puerto Rico, and I grew up there for 10 years. In Puerto Rico, I got a real strong sense of my Latin culture and history because, you know, I grew up in a neighborhood that was mostly Cuban, and so in my mind, I was in this kind of autonomous zone that was very Cuban. The music, the food, everything's very similar, the architecture. And I stopped at this photograph because it was one of the first structures that captured my imagination because of the age. And I remembered this, you know, since I was a little kid. I remember always going back. This is the fort of San Juan, which is El Morro, it's called. And, you know, they have this in Cuba, Cartagena, Colombia. It's the Spanish fortresses that sort of held the English and the French back from fighting, from taking over these countries as the Spanish took control. And it remained in my psyche for many years because I was always interested in time and time passing and texture and history. And walls was something that I felt told that story in a sort of psychogeographical way. But it remained really in my subconscious because it wasn't until many years later that I would really revisit that. I moved back to Miami when I was 10 years old, and it was the time when the Mariel boat lift was happening. And for those of you that might not know about the Mariel boat lift, it began when the Peruvian embassy opened its doors to a few people to get their visas to leave Cuba at a time when people weren't allowed to leave Cuba for many, many years. At that time, you know, people started breaking through the embassy fences and making a huge, you know, protest of not being able to travel out of Cuba for so many years. I mean, this is in 1980, and prior to 1980, the revolution was in 59. So you can imagine it was, you know, 30-something odd years that people weren't allowed to travel. And by that point, 350,000 Cubans left Havana by boats, and family members from Miami who had exiled in the 60s had gone to pick them up, and, you know, a lot of people died at sea. It was a really difficult time for Cuban families. I was coming to Miami at that time when it was like the Miami Dolphins were, you know, playing the San Francisco, the 49ers, and and the Cuban exiles were living under, you know, highways, you know, and there was a lot of crime. A lot of the Cuban jails were emptied, and so it was, you know, it was also the era of, you know, another famous Cuban, Italian actually, who played a Cuban. And so I grew up in this very tumultuous time in Miami, Florida in the 80s, which was very dangerous to be out in the streets, and that's what kids wanted to do, just kind of like go out and explore. So to be an artist was actually pretty surreal because it's a city that for a long time, maybe still is, was all about money making. There's a lot of crime. There was a lot of dark sides of society. So if you're an artist, people were always telling you that, you know, you're gonna go broke or you're not gonna make a living, and that you're gonna, you know, have no success. And so it was really challenging. At that time, I was really into breakdancing during the time that Miami Vice was going on, and so like the whole aspect of underground culture really is what really, I don't know, allowed me to understand American society, because I had gone through the culture shock of leaving Puerto Rico and only speaking Spanish and learning English, and I didn't really relate to kids playing football, or I didn't relate to cheerleaders. I didn't know any of that stuff that was going on in public schools. But I related automatically to like breakdancing and underground culture and hip hop music. And well, it was the time of the Overtown riots, so I found it really strange because growing up in Puerto Rico, I didn't really experience racism because Puerto Rico's tiny and Puerto Ricans are, mixed of all cultures. You have Chinese, Puerto Rican, black, white, Jewish, everything. And so it was just pretty much like we're all Puerto Rican. Got to Miami and it was like people were saying, don't cross 117th Avenue. And so of course I crossed 117th Avenue, I got beat up by black kids. Then the black kids would get beat up in my neighborhood and it was just messed up. And so art really kind of held it down for me. That was a big drug bust. That was another thing you saw on the news like every day in Miami. So drugs were like a major part of like something I tried to avoid all the time because there was so much violence that was going on. And so imagine being an artist and everybody else is like the opposite. It was all about gold chains, cocaine, crime, By 1986, I got shot and I was hospitalized and I almost lost my foot. And the only thing that kept me going was thinking about art. And I bring all this stuff up because it's my personal story, but also because there's, in every one of us, there's all these things that we must overcome. And I think being artists, it's almost a duty to overcome those things and to share those things and to be able to show resilience and share that message. Well, then, I was breakdancing for a really long time and writing graffiti. And at that time, anyways, we didn't call it graffiti, so it was kind of like a thing that became a challenge to be able to successfully become an artist and not be pigeonholed into that. But I took that culture on really strongly, and I was influenced by what was going on in New York in the 1970s and 80s and all the train painting, and I would come back and forth from New York to Miami, Florida. And I was known at that time under the name Ease, which was, a nickname that was given by my big brother. And at that time, I would keep tons of sketchbooks. I was already painting canvases, but I would sneak out of the house to go and paint with my friends and paint walls, paint trains. So I got a lot of training and being familiar with paint and the elements and painting fast because you had to get things done and you had to kind of make it look as beautiful as possible so that the next day people would see something very impactful. This is one of my black book covers where I wrote the names of artists that I was painting with, in those teenage years. But I chose this photo because it's kind of like one of the first times I'd made a list in black and white that is kind of like this style of my work that became diaristic that you'll see later on in the work, where I wrote tons and tons of layers of writing in black and white. And this is what the inside of those books would look like. So it was very colorful. It was the opposite. And it was a style of, what we call piecing, computer rock styles, sketching. So you could see, the interlocking letters, which is kind of like the secret code of writers, where writers would learn the different styles and you would understand each other's style, but the regular person walking by, the passerby, wouldn't understand it. And so it was more like a secret society in a way. We were trying to isolate ourselves and only communicate within each other because we did feel like vernacular. We felt like outsiders, like we didn't belong in a lot of ways. And part of that showed right away in the language. I kept a lot of scrapbooks and sketchbooks, and so here's one that actually I found from 1987 that predates a lot of the abstract work that I did and predates a lot of the textual work that I did because it was a scrapbook and it was made of like a chunk of a wall that I found and I thought it was interesting. I pasted it on my book, and then it has like this kind of monoprint and layering. But for many years I didn't do anything like that, but this was an interesting kind of experiment. I'm here with my friends. I'm the little kid on the top of the wall, and I was painting the final background upside down. We didn't have ladders and stuff. And I won a scholarship with this ink on board piece called Graffiti City, which is like the downtown Miami. And I got a full paid scholarship to Savannah College of Art and Design. There's Savannah there. And it was a real different atmosphere. It was really quiet, beautiful trees and parks. So I was going nuts because I was like, wow, it's too quiet here. And, there's the painting department. Then I went to Atlanta, Georgia, where I had my first studio and my first gallery show, and that kind of started my understanding of the kind of gallery world and where I was going with it. This is a painting that is one of the first paintings that I did that had these kind of collage elements and writing and textural elements and layering of walls. So it's semi-realistic, semi-abstract. It almost feels like this kind of idea of like a segmented reality, as if I had just snapped a photograph of an actual wall, but it was all being made as a painting. And the idea came from just seeing so many walls and so many places that I had painted with friends or I had done for years that were ephemeral. They eventually disappear. They were being erased by the city, or they were being painted over by other artists. So everything was ephemeral. It didn't last. So I wanted to make paintings that sort of arrested those aspects of fragments of walls in society. And so this is one of my first studios. You can kind of see here the layered calligraphic works, some of the earliest ones where I was doing like diaristic writing. And then I moved to New York at that point. And one of the first things I did when I got to New York was I arranged all my materials in the kind of cityscape. And it's funny because this is the World Trade Center, it's the Twin Towers and the Empire State Building. But for some reason at that point, I put a little Cuban flag on top of the Twin Towers. And my mom spotted that recently and was like, wow, you would have never imagined at that time that you'd do the World Trade Center. But going forward, this is my first studio in New York, which is in downtown Brooklyn. And you can see I was still doing these experiments with found wood and ink and tons of collage. And as I move forward into the future studios, they become cleaner and more organized. But at that time, I was just really kind of going wild. And this is one of those pieces from that era, which is it's a piece called Sign of the Times, where I took the actual wooden board and I left it outside in the city. I attached it to a building on Pell Street in Chinatown, and I just left it out there for 6 months, and people would write on it, collage stuff on it, write whatever, and also it became deteriorated during the winter. And then I got it back after 6 months, and I presented it as is. So it's a piece that actually played with the elements of being outdoors. This is another one from that same series called Your History, which people actually did put posters, and people ripped posters, and people wrote stuff on them. And then I interacted with this one different than the other. I actually worked on it in the studio afterwards to work it more to my liking. And those two are about 2001, 2002. This is also from that era. It's called Pirate Station, and it's the idea that, when you're in the subway and you're looking through the subway window and you're in a tunnel, you have spotlights every couple of meters, and everything's in motion, and so you just get these flashes of light, and sometimes you'd see writing, but it looks like it's in motion, it looks animated. So I wanted to replicate that feeling, and that's why some of these strokes, you have like this one light in the middle, and then you have these strokes kind of moving, and everything else is blurry because you're looking at it from the inside of the train. So I'm dealing with like realism and also just the imagination. This is one of the more abstract early pieces that I did, also from the year 2001, titled Utopia. This is the same studio, just another view, different body of work. And around this time was when, September 11th happened, the attacks on the Twin Towers. And I reacted by doing a painting titled Gemini, which is of the attacks. And you could see it's kind of my view from Brooklyn of the smoke of the World Trade Center, after the fire, and how that smoke went up in this arch over the city, all the way towards Coney Island and into the atmosphere. And it was a very dark piece because of the dark times, and I wasn't really sleeping very much, so I kept painting on this surface, and I became very ill. I remember, like, towards the time that I was finishing this painting, I ended up in the hospital. And it's just, I'm one of those artists where, everything that I do is reacting to the times, and it becomes very, very real, very emotional. And at that point, I realized that I'm interacting not only with the city, not only with walls, but somehow politically interacting with the sign of our times. And that was one of the important pieces that I felt I did at the time, which exhibited finally in New York and then in Paris. I went to London right after that, and I started this relationship with Europe. It was the first time I had gone over there, and did an exhibition there titled Adaptation Translation, and did this piece at the very end, which was a kind of piece that dealt with the sounds of the city. and a diary, and these calligraphic pieces that led you into it. That was an installation at this place called Elms Lester's Painting Rooms, 2002. Then I went to Japan for the first time, and I explored ceramics, where I learned how to do a type of ceramic called bisenyaki. Bisenyaki is a natural earthenware clay that nothing gets added to it. There's no resins, or there's no glazing. It's all just pure mineral earth. So I decided to do these tablets that were sort of resonant to the original inscriptions of pictography from Mesopotamia and other parts of the world, ancient tablets, but I wanted to do the inscriptions of my style of writing that is contemporary. And so this is kind of one of the pieces from that time. There's another one. And in Japan, I started doing these calligraphic pieces that were inspired by their brushstrokes, by Asian calligraphy. And I didn't want to just do like a normal red or black ink. So I found someone who was making natural pigments. And I was doing drawings and calligraphy with only water and throwing the pigment onto the page, and it would only stick to what's wet. But if you saw one of these in person, and if you guys go to Bryce Wolkowitz Gallery on 24th Street, there's two pieces from, newer pieces from this series, where you could see in detail, tons and tons of detail in each stroke. It becomes kind of like its own universe. So it's a way to capture the style of writing and put it in a setting of traditional calligraphy. And then this is Havana, Cuba. I had never been to Cuba until I was 24 years old. I went to really try and meet the family that was left there. I never met my grandparents and any of my family that was there. My grandparents had already died, so I wanted to go and explore Cuba and also meet whoever was there so I could kind of get a better sense of self. And I was just impressed and amazed of the layers of the city. It's a pretty big city. And because of the conditions that it's in, all the walls show you tons and tons of its history. And there's new architecture, well, new in terms of like modern architecture in the 60s that is contrasting this, colonial and earliest 20th century architecture. And a lot of the walls are exposing all these layers and colors and scratching and history. And so it was like a really huge point of inspiration for me to be able to start working with these kind of like really heavy textures in my work. I feel like after this trip, my work really grew and expanded into very textured, very heavy, very dense pieces. So you start to see a lot of these kind of like shapes and dimensions showing up in the painting because of that trip and because of what I saw on the walls there. This is another wall in Havana. I mean, you see stuff like this in New York, but Havana is like a whole different dimension because it's an older city. And so I came back, and around that time, I had met Bryce Wolkowitz. We had done a prior show to this as a group show, but my first solo show was titled Walls, Diaries, and Paintings, and I took over the hallway of the gallery as an installation that went all the way to the ceilings of a kind of alleyway, plastered with texture, posters. But the one thing that I did different was I found a telephone, a public phone in the Bronx that had been totally mutilated and shot up, and I took it and I inserted a little iPod, an iPhone that you could call, and you could pick up the phone like it was my phone. You could hear my messages. I gave you access to my world. You could hear music, anything. So if you knew about it, you would go there and do it. If you didn't know about it and you happened to pick it up, somebody would be on there. You could press numbers and get into my answering machine. So it kind of let you become more close to me and personal. And there was a secret door so that you could see it from another angle when you walk through. And there's one of the calligraphic pieces as well, juxtaposed with one of the more diaristic pieces. And then this is another part of the installation. These pieces are more, when they're layered like this, it sort of reminded me of how memory might be stored in the back of our minds. Just all the memories and lives, stories of our life that we've lived, how they might be stored. And so I write it layer upon layer upon layer, but in a sense, although it's my own personal story, it's so abstract that it can become your own personal story as the viewer. So you can imagine that it's your own personal story or situation or lifeline, if you will. There's another exhibition that I did in Los Angeles where it was titled Character Gestures. And the concept of character gestures came from this idea that there's this kind of theater going on in my paintings, and that a lot of the mark making in the paintings, like you've seen in some of these kind of marks, could be made by other people. So it's not just me, but I'm imagining someone walking by and tearing a poster, putting a poster up, writing something, tearing something, marking something. So I imagine that every time I attacked the piece, that the composition was just a fragment of a place, as if you were photographing it through a viewfinder. So you'll notice in a lot of the paintings, there's never a composition that keeps you inside the frame. Everything comes in, everything goes out. So it's just like a small fragment of something that is much larger. And at that time, I introduced my first sculptures made of cement, which were kind of like there's these sidewalk pieces, but they're also like tombstones in a sense, because they're kind of encapsulating the story. And I imagine that at this point somebody had kind of dug up the sidewalk and put a pipe and then recovered it again, and when it was wet, someone, you see it all the time, you see people inscribing into the sidewalk. And I wanted to present that along with these other sculptures that were soft sculptures made up of painter's rags. These are the rags from my studio that I use to paint and also scrub the surface of the painting. The way that I do staining or the way that I sand the pieces sometimes is by a dry brush or by dry rags, but it ends up accumulating on these rags, and there's like tons and tons of them. So I started photographing them, and the act of photographing them is what made them into these sculptures. And they resembled to me like body parts, almost like a shoulder or your elbow or like the parts of your body. So these are very much an extension of me. So they became these very physical pieces, not only because they're sculptures, but also because of what they represent. This piece is titled Cyclone's Capsule, and it's one that I dedicated to Cy Twombly when he passed away. And a lot of the colors are samples directly from a series of work of Cy Twombly's where he used these greens and terracottas. And the idea of sampling really comes from hip-hop music, just the way that like Eric B. and Rakim would sample James Brown. For those of you who don't know about who those artists are, I mean, it's part of hip-hop culture. How it all started was by the younger generation was listening to the records that their parents had and sampling that and recreating their own music. So for me, Cy Twombly was a big influence, because at painting class in Savannah, because I was bringing in this street element and this like very hip hop element, a lot of the teachers didn't agree with it. It's different now, but in the 1990s, it was kind of like a zone that you didn't go into, because the school kind of wanted you like to perform in a sort of classical sphere and like focus on your fundamentals. And I was doing the fundamentals and I was doing them pretty well, but then I was going right into doing more of my abstract work. And one of my teachers said to me that, that didn't belong in school, that it was trash. And so I ended up walking out of there and ended up in the school library. And that's what leads you to this painting. That library had a photography show, a black and white photo show of Robert Rauschenberg's New York street photographs. And one of those stood out because it was the only interior photograph of a studio that Rauschenberg and Cy Twombly shared. And so it led me to understand these artists better and do research about them. And I went through the school library, and I got myself all these books, and I armed myself to go back to the class. And I dropped all the books on the teacher's desk. And I said, how come you didn't tell me about these painters? And it was Joan Mitchell, it was Cy Twombly, Antoni Tapies, Aaron Siskind, all these really important artists that were all urban artists in a sense, but they weren't pigeonholed that. They were pigeonholed as abstract expressionists, but they were thinking the same. They were living in Soho. They were, they're the reason why Williamsburg exists, or like that kind of loft style, because they were poor, they were working real hard, and they weren't accepted in their time. And so for me, it's important to share that with you, because you have to go and arm yourself with history and challenge your professors. Sorry, guys, but you probably want that anyways. And so this was kind of a big part of my life. And then this is another part of that installation where I juxtaposed the hanging sculptures with these monotransfers that are actual paper pieces that are pressed onto the wet surfaces of the paintings and peeled and repressed while different paintings are wet. And so I'm using the papers as a tool to transfer paint around, but at the same time they become part of the documentation of the process of the painting, because I thought that with this show I would expose to the viewer the making of the work, but not through a video and not through like photographs, but through actual objects that you could follow the color from this to a painting, from the rag to another painting, and how these could be kind of the children of the paintings, and you could understand the process a little bit more in a tactile way. This is one of the mono transfers. This is a painting from that show. It's a more monochromatic piece. This time I was being commissioned to do the Brooklyn Academy of Music's Bam Fisher building, and I did a painting that dealt with gesture and performative dance, and it was a way to kind of connect to the history of Bam. And so when you walk in, you see this piece that's all about movement, and when I painted it, I was able to paint it on location. I would run back and forth from end to end of the painting, and it reminded me of the size of a subway train, and also kind of a subway station because of these columns. And so I wanted to capture that energy of the history of where I'm coming from with painting, but also connect it to the history of dance and music and performative aspects in art. Then I went back to Cuba in 2012 to do the first project I would do there with my friend JR, who's are you guys familiar with JR? He's a painter, a photographer and filmmaker, and we did I'm gonna play a little video for you guys. It's a project called Wrinkles of the City, where we did 20 murals around the city of Havana during the biennial of massive faces of elderly folks, like grandparents, really random folks that we found around the city. And we wanted to tell their story by comparing the wrinkles of their faces to the wrinkles of the walls and the textures in the city. So.
Buenas tardes, buenos días, buenas noches. Bueno, me encuentro junto a dos artistas muy importantes invitados a la 11ª Bienal de La Habana.
Hemos trabajado con entrevistas a personas mayores, 25 en total, de todas partes de La Habana, que escogimos casualmente caminando por las calles de La Habana.
Aguila y Colón.
What I find interesting in Cuba is that you don't have any advertising anywhere. You're in a city where the walls speak for themselves. They speak for their history, their past, their wrinkles. The only image you see are the portraits of Fidel or Che. That's why I think it's interesting to come here and work on a project that would bring out our images on the wall.
So unlike what we're used to, in the Western world, in Cuba, there's not one single advertising at all. So no one's selling you shampoo or sneakers or a car, anything. So when you walk around, actually, when you get there, you kind of get this peace of mind and this silence. But you do see a lot of political propaganda, a lot of like the kind of revolutionary posters and murals, the revolution and things like that. So people are accustomed to that. So suddenly we start doing these massive walls. I mean, you can see how big they are. And we did 20 of them throughout the city in the most visible places. And the public was just astonished. They're like, what's going on? Who are these people? What are you doing? And they assumed automatically that these people are revolutionary heroes, political heroes. But in fact, they were all alive. And we would say, no, take another look. That's your neighbor. That's, the dancer from down the street. That's the railroad worker. That's the doctor. That's the, And so people were, not accustomed to that. And they still exist. Some of them are starting to deteriorate a little bit, but they still exist. This little guy here is a little boxer that posed for us out of nowhere. He really was good. He's training. He'll probably be an Olympic champion one day. And then this one we did by hanging from ropes. I mean, it was pretty incredible to do this project because, first of all, you're in Cuba and nothing works. There's no art stores. You can't get materials easily. There's no Home Depot. So you have to, we sent a massive, container from Paris all the way to Cuba. We were going to do it from Panama. That didn't work out. Canada didn't work out. So we went to France because GR is French. And we filled the container with ladders, scaffolding, paint, everything under the sun, cameras, everything. And we shipped it to Cuba. And we're lucky it all worked out. But then we hired local workers to help us do everything. We even found guys that are like mountain climbers who helped us hang from buildings with ropes. And it was incredible. It was an incredible experience. I came back and I ended up doing I was commissioned for the Barclays Center entrance, which is a work in progress. I did a painting called The Diary of Brooklyn, which you see me working both at a studio and then after install, I finished it on location. And it's a painting that pays homage to the borough of Brooklyn, musicians, artists, and all kinds of folks that have come out of Brooklyn. And it's the entrance piece. This one and BAM were like the kind of pieces that were happening at the same time. In 2012, while I was back and forth to Cuba and Brooklyn, that sort of cemented this kind of architectural collaboration that I've been doing now, that I'm also now continuing to do with different architects, and kind of opened the doors for me to do more public artwork, which is kind of going back full circle to where I come from, because I started out painting in public and painting out in the city. And then, I was always concerned with, because, in the 1980s, doing works out on the city, you were a vandal, and so you weren't accepted by the system. And so for me, I wanted to infiltrate that work and bring it into the gallery system, into the museum system, but not lose any of its texture, not lose any of its, grit. And so that was a really major challenge. And now it's funny because now society has changed and we've become more accepted. I always say we because I'm kind of like part of like this group of artists. But we've become more accepted, but at the same time, there's always the challenges on how people view what your work is. And I've always chosen to, define myself rather than let other people define me. And it's really rare that someone like Greg Tate can write something so eloquent that you really agree with, because most of the time you don't end up agreeing with. But this is one of those pieces that really kind of changed my life. And then I ended up in London after that, working with a gallery called Hunch of Venison, which I ended up showing a whole new body of work in 2013. This painting is titled Day and Night in London Town. And the work became more abstract. I had just come back from a trip to India, which was really inspiring for me to be able to kind of dive into the colors there and the textures of the city there, and a kind of new, interpretation of other people's spirituality and politics. And so this show was really diverse in terms of like where I was coming from at that point in my life, and also continuing on to do this kind of like sculptural, soft sculptural work. I devised this kind of system of ropes with these painter's rags that resembled a kind of stage, and so you could come up the stairs and see them from below and see them from the side on this room. I went to Japan during the time of the Tohoku earthquake, which devastated most of Fukushima and Sendai, and was very difficult for Japan, but for the world as well. And I did a painting called Nippon, which is the Japanese name of the country Japan. And it's the first circular painting I ever did, which when you hung it on a white wall, it's the Japanese flag. And with this painting, I was able to raise funds to help an organization that was raising funds to move families out of the Sendai area. And now it's in a museum called the Parla Art Museum in Hakone, Japan. This is an exhibition at the Yukasuruno Gallery in Tokyo. And this is a painting that I've made there in Japan in a residency called Haru Ichiban, which means the first wind of spring. And it was interesting because I was painting at this art center that's right next to the water in the Tokyo Bay. And when spring starts to come in, there's tons of strong winds, and you could hear it through the alleyways of Tokyo, whistling through. And in that period is when you start to see the birth of the cherry blossoms. So it went from like dark gray skies and, you know, cloudy winter, and it just switched. And so all these spring colors really inspired this painting. And it's one of the first paintings when I'm dealing with not only like the city and those textures, but with nature and the changing of time and the seasons. And it's a 50-foot long painting that was commissioned for this art center. Then I worked with the Hunt Library in North Carolina State University with the architecture firm called Snowheta to do the centerpiece of the, this is when I went to first see the site and kind of work with the architects in the school to talk about the project. And here I am doing the piece on site, which is titled Nature of Language. It was the first piece I've done for a library, and it was inspired by the history of language and the history of where language comes from and the diversity of language in the history of humanity. So it's layers and layers and layers and layers of the names of languages and countries and historians and professors and artists, and it kind of became this calligraphic sea that made up the painting. So conceptually, it's something that I wanted to present to the school, and they really liked it. And I was able to do it on site. I really liked that. And this is the library. It's a library that's interesting because it's the biggest in the United States, and also has a robotic system that holds 3 million books. And it's not your typical library where it's quiet. You're actually allowed to just be loud and normal, and it's kind of more like a hangout. And then if you need quiet spaces, they've also done quiet rooms in different parts of the library. But you come in, and from an app on your phone or your iPad or whatever, you can select the books that you want, and a massive robot selects all the books, and someone brings you the books, or they can bring you the books in your dorm or wherever. So it's an interesting place. And during that time, I had been working out of a smaller studio in downtown Brooklyn, and I wanted to expand on the work that I was doing architecturally and do bigger work. So I started searching for a new space, and I came across this little warehouse in downtown Brooklyn that I presented to the guys from Snowheta, the architects that I worked on that project, and they designed the space for me, which we overhauled completely and exposed all natural light, and has different sections. One is the arena where all the work gets done, and another one is a kind of resting area where you can think and read books and whatnot. And during that time, I was commissioned to do, this is the entrance of the studio, to do the World Trade Center painting, which I titled Union of the Senses, which you see the size of it here in the studio, and me working on it there. I worked on it by jumping off ladders, doing these like really long, broad strokes. So I would jump from the top of the ladder all the way down, and keeping the brush on the surface to get these long lines. And then here it is being installed and doing the finishing touches in the lobby of the World Trade Center from a different angle. It's hard to appreciate it through photographs, but there it is. And then this is the High Museum exhibition called Segmented Realities, which you mentioned earlier, and different views of the work. Some of these paintings were chosen by the curator to kind of give a historical perspective of my work. So there were older works at the top floor, and then all new works at the bottom, where I first introduced sculptural paintings, as I call them, because they're double-sided and they're inspired by the Berlin Wall. Last year was the 25th anniversary of the falling of the Berlin Wall, which resonated with me because when the Berlin Wall fell, a lot of people in Cuba and in Miami thought that socialism, communism was falling and that things would change. But obviously, now is when things started to change with Cuba. So it was a kind of connection to 25 years ago and that thought process, and to what's actually happening now with the two governments finally having conversations and talking and doing all these positive things. And these are just different views. And some of these works and some new ones are also on view at Bryce Wolkowitz Gallery and Mary Boone Gallery. These are the pieces. And then I did new works that actually traveled to Cuba on the Malecón, which is the sea wall in the downtown area of Cuba. It's the wall that divides the sea, north being like the United States, and then the city of Havana. The Havana Biennial chose 40 artists to interact with different plazas throughout the whole city. And I was able to do new works that resembled this kind of Berlin Wall, which is kind of controversial there because they don't want you to talk about the Berlin Wall falling there. But it was just really obvious and people talked about it and it was interesting. And then I made new works for the standard Highline Plaza, which are still up here in New York. And if you guys are down in that area, it's not too far from here. It's on 13th Street in Washington, next to the Whitney Museum, so you have an opportunity to check both out. The difference with these and the previous works is that these, although these were made for outdoors, they're made of wood. They were only made to be outdoors for a shorter period of time. These I experimented with foam, polyester resin, epoxy resin paints, and steel framing inside. So these can actually last outdoors for a very long time, you know. And so the idea behind that is to make more permanent pieces that look like really old parts of buildings. And then the most recent shows, I'll just give you a little snippet of what's at Bryce Wolkowitz Gallery and some of the installations there, and also at Mary Boone Gallery. The difference with this new installation is that I actually, like in Cuba, I found a lot of debris and I was able to incorporate that into these walls. And that's it.
How did you find the courage to do what you do? As in, were you worried about job security, and how did you manage?
Well, I mean, this is a question that I get all the time from students, and I think that if you're passionate about your art, you're gonna do it regardless. And one of the first experiences that I had moving to New York, where like the pressure was really on to pay the bills, it's the most expensive city in the United States, was you know, knowing that in your heart, like you're gonna do it regardless of money. Because I mean, I waited tables, I was a construction worker, every kind of job under the sun, I've done it. I've cleaned people's homes, I've done demolition. I did it for years, and I did it while I painted. So it was about having some courage, but also like just, you know, not letting like the energy go into the wrong direction. Like if you had to work, you know, as a waiter, you had to find time to paint. So when everybody's going out partying and hanging out, I would go and paint. And then still find time to have fun and hang out too, don't get me wrong. I did a lot of hanging out. But you gotta do it all, because hanging out is where you meet your friends and you develop your community, and all the artists, you help each other and you push each other and you give each other courage. So that's what I think. You should just, you know, always find good friends, good people, and, you know, help each other out, push each other to do, you know, to do it, and to do it better every time, and, you know, challenge yourself, definitely. Any other questions? All right.
So the piece of that poster on the library that you did on site, can you guys hear me?
It's for the recording.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry. Okay, so I have a materials question for you. For the library commission that you did, what kind of, is it a marker? Is it a pen? Is it a paint? I mean,
It's all paintbrush. So first you saw all the red blends. All that, it was all oil paint, but I used Japan dryer to make the oil paint dry faster, because otherwise it'd take forever. And then it was all oil paint with thin brushes and then thicker brushes to get the, you know, broader strokes. And because it's like really in proximity of people touching it and playing with it all the time, I covered it with a matte epoxy resin, because the resin, you can even like write on it with a marker and you can just wipe that off, and so it really protects the piece, and it could last a really long time. Also has UV protection, because there's tons of sunlight coming in, so it won't yellow. Anyone else? All right.
Do you find that it's integral to incorporate your background and what you know of your heritage into your art, or is it just something that's always kind of found its way into it?
It's a good question. I don't think it's integral for every artist. It's been integral for me because there was a certain struggle that was attached to my work, that it was about survival. And so the work, every step of the way, has been there in a kind of you know, supportive way, to allow me to get through like really crazy passages. Like I explained about Miami being such a dangerous place. You know, there was so many kids that I knew my own age were all hooked on drugs. There were tons of people died, went to jail. It was a situation where art, for me, was a sort of a savior. So I incorporated it because also I saw the challenges in society where there was a group of large group of people around the world just like myself that were being told it wasn't art and that it wasn't good and that it came from bad roots. And so we were just good kids, like with I guess coming from neighborhoods that had terrible educational programs, with very bad art schools, with all that kind of stuff. So for me, it was integral, but I don't think it's integral for everybody. I mean, I've done tons of other, ideas and works that don't necessarily deal with just, this kind of urban texture, but and less, and more so now. I think now I'm kind of making this departure, and I'm having to find more courage to sort of like step away from what I know or my comfort zone and do new things.
Do you sometimes like think to yourself, okay, I want to go out and like tag, throw some pieces up, or are you like beyond that point?
You're never really beyond it. It's not like you're beyond it, but I did it for 25 straight years.
Yeah.
And then eventually you're just like, I retire. And I know some of the, the founders of this movement, and we've painted and we've done a lot of things. And, I don't want to get in trouble anymore. I got in tons of trouble.
Do you find yourself still, because for me, your work has such a strong sense of your surroundings and your physical space, and going along with that question, do you feel the same energy when you do show in a gallery or in a set space, or is it more free for you or less free now?
There's actually more interaction when you're working in the gallery than when you've just done something anonymously in the city, because you do something at night and you leave it and no one knows who you are, what you look like, anything, and you never know who's seeing it, what their interaction is with the work, and you don't. But with doing shows in galleries and museums, you get to meet the people, you have conversations, you get to really have this interaction, and you're constantly learning. Like the way you have critiques in school, when you're in the real world, like galleries and museums, and you're really putting yourself out there, you're really in the thick of it. You're constantly getting a critique, real life critique, and so you're learning intensely. And it's all like bits of information, and depending on how you interpret it, will inform how good your next work is or how bad it is, But I think there's more interaction this way. Huh?
Next time you get every person on the microphone.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really fascinating to watch your visual history journey. I wanted to ask a question about Sign of the Times, one of the first pieces that you showed. And it was probably the only piece I saw in your whole slide deck where you kind of played this role of curator, as opposed to, you really just decided to let that piece do its thing out in the world, and then you just decided to show it as is without any sort of interaction with it. Can you talk us through the decision-making process to do that?
Sure. Well, that piece, Sign of the Times, the reason I decided that is because right around that point, I had been doing these kind of works, but they were more like replications or kind of interpretations of places that I had been to. Sometimes I would collect chunks of posters. I would bring back posters from London or from Italy, and I would incorporate those as collage in my work. And during a trip to London, I was at the Tate Modern Museum, and I came across an artist called Jacques Vieglé, and across from him, another painter named Mimo Rotella. They were part of a movement known as Nouveau Realism. And they were going around the city, Rotella, the Italian, would go around Napoli, and Vieglé in Paris. And there was a third one called Raymond Ain. They would go around and tear huge billboard posters off the walls and show them as is. So I thought, wow, I've been doing this, but I've been going about it in a way where it was about replication or interpretation. And theirs was different because they were actually reassembling their personal. They broke away from Nouveau Realism, and they became known as the affichistes, and kind of assemblage right? So they were assembling these big chunks that they got from walls and using parts that were as is, but reassembling them. So I took it a little bit further and I just let it happen and let the weather deteriorate it and you know, become brown and get dirty. And then I just showed it as is. It's a kind of like historical context connection to these artists that were another part of my influence. I mean, for me, the context of knowing history is really important. And I think you all should really think about history all the time, is because they're just weapons that you use to arm yourself in conversations because you will always be confronted by people who, you know, are going to challenge you. And the more history you know, first of all, the stronger your work can be, because then you're going to understand where the root of something is coming from, but also where you can take it from slightly different, you know, because originality is a kind of questionable thing. There's not that much original things in the world, and that's okay. Like, I think a lot of pressure that we put on ourselves is like, I gotta be original, I gotta be like one of a kind, and that's good. But, you know, everything comes from something. You don't just like, you know, derive out of like, you know, the ether, something totally original. So knowing the history is important so you don't make mistakes about thinking you're original and somebody did it 40 years ago, you know. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm wondering if you can tell the students, because it's a question that I often get, about your very first commercial gallery experience and connection, how you established that, how it came about for you in your life.
This is great because it actually came through students, my own classmates. I had gone to Savannah College of Art and Design, and then a lot of the natural progression was for a lot of students from Savannah to go up to Atlanta, Georgia, because it was like the bigger city, right? And we used to go to Atlanta primarily because all the big concerts were going on over there. So we wanted to see, like, you know, whatever was hot at the moment. So we made friends at different schools, and eventually a lot of students moved there. And one of my classmates named Roll Daves III, he was a painter. He knew a gallerist who was interested in seeing new work, you know, and they organized a studio visit. So it was just that simple. And college, one of the things that's really important about college, besides studying and, you know, technique and all that, is all your friendships and connections. All those things is so integral to your future. Keeping those contacts, those friendships, those relationships, you know, and that's what I meant earlier about like that community, like, you know, pushing each other, helping each other. Because a friend of mine opened the door to have a dual studio visit. We both set up a space, we put our works up, and that opened up doors to our first ever show. And when I sold a piece for like $1,000, I was like, wow, I'm rich, you know. And it was awesome, you know. And so that, you know, that also gives you inspiration, because, you know, one thing that I've done a lot of stuff with like younger kids, like you know, like high school kids, junior high school kids. And what I do with the programs is that I get them to create work and exhibit work, but we get their work to sell, because selling work is also part of like the, you know, what encourages you to make a living off of it. Otherwise, you know, it's okay to be an artist and not, you know, sell work and, you know, just have a job. That's great, you know. But if you can do it, and I think there's more possibilities now than there ever were before. You know, like when I was your age, there wasn't like this international art fair situation that's everywhere now. It was like 1 or 2 art fairs that were important. Now there's like 50 of them, you know, everywhere. You know, and there's like all this youth culture movement, and everybody wants the young artists and the young, and you should take advantage of it. There's so much going on. Yeah.
So in connection with that, I know that decay and sort of like this look at deterioration is a big aspect of your work, and it seems like you're also playing with not only the traditional art materials, but also, you know, posters and, you know, things that won't be as permanent. Mm-hmm. Has there sort of been a push, or is that something you struggle with, you know, now that your work is more on a commercial level? Is that something that's brought into question, or how do you deal with that, you know? You know what? It hasn't really been something of an issue for me. I'm still making works that I'm really passionate about that deal with these kind of issues that are political, or, you know, a lot of the deterioration in the work, or the decay aspect of it. It comes from the idea of neglect and the kind of neighborhoods that are more neglected versus others, you know. Because if I'm painting paintings that are about walls,
You won't catch me painting like, Madison and 77th, with like a brand new marble rock, although that could be interesting though. But, it's like the new work right now at both galleries plays with the conversation of what's going on politically between Cuba and the United States. But there's random pieces about Puerto Rico, there's random pieces about New York, and the conversation that I'm having in my life and how it ends up in the work. And so it's just a continuation of where I started off. But if you look at the colors, the textures, the materials that are being used, they're different. There's an expansion of it. And for me, it's always been important to find relevance and connection between older works and the kind of gradation that I'm heading towards. And it's a slow process to eventually end up in somewhere completely different.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for an impressive and encouraging presentation. And my question is for you. What is the relationship between your works and the society? And did you think that your works would change some parts of the society?
I think not only that, her question for you, for those of you who didn't hear her, is what are my connections between my work and society, and would my work, or does my work change society in any way? Is that your question? Yeah. Does it have the power to change society in any way? Yeah. I think art has tremendous power. All types of art has incredible power. Music, dance, painting, self-expression, performance, film. Without it, we have a gigantic desert, desolate of any kind of love or purity. Art is the most powerful tool that we have to change society. Art, has inspired architecture, politicians, so you might think that you're doing an abstract painting, but you never know. Like, who's this young kid and what that young kid grows up to become. Could be the next president, could be the next, pope, and they'll eventually have been, their work has eventually changed because of the power in your art and what you've done, or an actor does in a play, or a song does for somebody. So when you're making art, you have to be conscious that you have power, and what's coming from you is just as important as what has come from artists in the past, or anyone else. And that's the power in art, that we can straddle, all kinds of parts of society as well. Like, I still hang out with homeless people in the street that I'm interested in talking to, and I've been in the room with presidents of different countries and had conversations. And that's the thing about art that I think is really powerful, is that you can intersect all these avenues and have those conversations and share an experience with someone who's powerless and bring that to someone who's powerful, and intersect those avenues and create something of awareness. Welcome.
I get to ask the last question. First of all, thank you very much, Jose. It was a wonderful talk. But I have to ask, because I was thinking about throughout the presentation, which is the relationship between image and text, which is such an important dichotomy for lots of artists these days. And one of the things that I find so vibrant in your work is that you look at the city, and the city doesn't sort of ask you to make an image of it. The city asks more that you write something literally on it, or write in such a way that you're replicating it. I never before had that thought that, well, out in the country, the way Greg Tate was writing about historical landscapes, the country sort of, it more automatically asks us to envision it as an image. And the city, in some ways, though there are lots of artists, think of Hopper, for example, who look at the image and want to make an image, and look at the city and want to make an image of it. In some way, it seems more kind of natural, in some way, more urban, to look at the city and respond to it textually, which is why I found it so interesting that when you went to Havana and didn't see much writing on the wall, you decided to put images up.
Well, the interesting thing about Havana is that they don't have spray paint like the rest of the world does, really so accessible. So people scratch on walls with like, rocks or keys. So there's all this like scratching everywhere. So it's more like microscopic. You look at the interesting part about just walls in general, and why I looked at walls in the way that I do, is because, first of all, I was writing on walls, and the walls became my message board. And they are the message board of the world. People, like for example, in Egypt, when the revolution just happened, all the walls were written on with all kinds of political messages, and in London as well, or in Ireland, for the last 800 years, people, wrote all kinds of, messages, religious messages. It's always been part of our history. And so also, as far as you can go with the cave paintings, it's the first, paintings that were ever done were done on walls. So it's just in our psyche, who we are as humans. So I always wanted to make those connections to the history of humanity and the history of painting. And so I was just compelled to do the connection between writing and also image making, because I'm a writer. I come from being a writer. And all the calligraphy and all the writing, it was about emotion. Like writing doesn't just, it's not just writing your name, but it's writing your name with style. It's writing your name with a kind of finesse and a kind of flow that was meaningful in a way. So even if it wasn't readable to some people, there was tons of meaning compact into it. And so that is the connection, between what I started out as and then the translation that ended up being an object that is a wall, that is a painting.
And so you're all encouraged to write on the walls of all the buildings at SVA, so long as you put something between the wall and what you're writing. Please join me again in giving a very warm thank you to José Parlá.
Thank you.